Why don't we start? Good morning, and I'd like to welcome you all to the Atlantic Council. I'm Dick Morningstar, and I'm the founding director of our new Global Energy Center here. And again, welcome to today's event on merging finance, regulation, and design for a sustainable energy future. And this panel is part of the center's new technology series, which what we're trying to do is examine new technologies in the energy sector and also reinforce two of what are the central pillars of what we're trying to do, which is sustainable energy solutions and strategic foresight, meaning what does all this mean? What does all this mean for the future? So today's panelists are all non-resident senior fellows in our center, and they're experts in sustainable energy finance, regulation, and design, respectively. And the three of them will each give a short presentation, then we'll have a dialogue and open it up for questions and comments that you may have. David Milner, right here, is the founder and CEO of NewGen Capital Management and has over 20 years of experience in private equity investment. David will talk about how new companies and startups are being financed and what's the future for that, as well as looking at things like the need for the continuation of subsidies with respect to renewables and related kinds of issues. And then Ross Channon is right there in the middle, is a visiting scholar at the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford and had been the CEO of a company that he started up, American Energy, which is American Efficient, which is, as it sounds, a company working to bring solutions in the efficiency area in a practical way to consumers and looking at how regulatory agencies need to deal with it. And he'll be talking about that, looking at some of the obstacles to renewables from a regulatory standpoint. And then Peter Dean, who's on the faculty at the Rhode Island School of Design, and Peter's been there for over 18 years. And is that all you've been there?
Yeah. Well, that doesn't count my years as a student, some years prior to that. So. Maybe.
And he focuses on sustainability in design, and he has created and nurtured the Nature Culture Sustainability Studies concentration at the Rhode Island School. So for those who may be out there in the ether watching us on the webcast, and also for the audience, you can contribute to the conversation on Twitter by utilizing hashtag #ACEnergy. So each of the panelists will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a dialogue among ourselves and open it up to the audience. So David, you're on.
Well, thank you, Ambassador Morningstar, and thank you to the Atlantic Council staff who've pulled this off, as well as everybody for coming. I'm going to keep my remarks brief. Kick me at 9 minutes, and I look forward to an interactive discussion. I think the topic is really important for the globe, and I want to sort of try to bring to focus how finance has come into the market, particularly over the last 5 to 7 years, and I'm going to focus on solar to sort of illustrate the changes we're seeing in the U.S. and globally. So to be clear, fossil fuels are and will be a massive part of the global energy mix for decades to come. In fact, solar in the U.S. provides less than 1% of our electric usage right now. But I believe we're in the first inning of a massive energy shift. And we might even be the first batter in that first inning, which will come over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 decades. And I don't think it's stoppable. But it'd be good to debate that. this week, two announcements about China caught my eye. One is that they've been installing more renewable energy than fossil fuels for the past several years, from all sources, not just solar. And the second thing, and this is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, the second thing is this year they're going to do 15 to 18 gigawatts of just solar. That's more than twice what the US did last year. We did about 6.2 gigawatts. So how has this happened? I want to sort of cover 3 C's, as I call it: capacity, costs, and capital. On the capacity side, let's talk about the sun. The ability for the sun to power our planet is truly almost limitless. You hear these statistics that in less than 1 hour, more sun energy that's harnessable hits our Earth than we use in a year. So there's no reason to think that humans can't take that energy and power our washing machines and light bulbs. We just haven't yet. So if you look at how that looks on a scale of other energy sources, the sun is 23,000 terawatts. We consume 16 terawatts a year. Not 16,000, 16. So that's, you get the stats there. So the key problem with this right now is battery and storage for it to really explode, but people are working on that, and I think that will be solved. But the potential is there, and it's powered life for billions of years. There's no reason we can't think it's going to power other things. On the costs, 2 charts for solar over the last 5-7 years, I think, tell the whole story. One is, my son did that little transition. I don't know how he did that in PowerPoint, but anyway. So the price of silicon went from $475 in 2008 per kilogram to 17. So silicon is not a rare earth. It's the second most common element in Earth's mantle. So it was high because there wasn't a real solar industry and there wasn't much use beyond computer chips. So that price has plummeted. So the other cost thing, which is directly connected, is the module price per watt. So you can see, forget the early part. Let's just focus on 2005, 6, 7 to today. It was $3.25, $3.50 in 2008. In fact, we looked at making solar investments in 2007 and 8, and we passed because it was way too expensive, and the regulatory incentive requirements we thought were too high. But when the world and the financial markets started to plummet, Lehman is somewhere around here, and the silicon, more supply came onto the market. You had the panels go to, this is 64 cents, right? So from 375 to 64 cents. So last week, there's a project that we're aware of that costs $1.33 a watt to install. That's labor, wiring, racking, panels, inverters, everything soup to nuts. So that project is 75% less than just the module at $375 6-7 years ago. So the scale of the costs is coming down so much that solar really is getting to be competitive without subsidies, and we can get into the subsidy conversation in many markets, and it's certainly extremely competitive today. So let's talk about capital. In 2010, so this is our cumulative installation. So there's 2010. In 2010, our entire country did 854 megawatts of solar. This week, literally one company ordered panels from one manufacturer that's 1.5 gigawatts to use this year. So one deal is more than twice, and this 5 years later, more than twice everything the entire country did in 2010. So in 2000, but how does that happen? How do you go from 5 years to that kind of an announcement? Well, there's 3 capital things that have happened. Access to bond markets, access to debt markets, and access to public equities, so the public Wall Street market. So in 2011, the biggest deal announced was a 550 megawatt solar farm that required $2.3 billion of capital. But the only way is called desert sunlight. The only way to get that done was for the Department of Energy to provide loan guarantees. So yeah, you have debt, but it's subsidized and backed by the US government. In 2011, or 2012, sorry, Solar City goes public, and whoops, I don't want to do that. And that's the beginning of the first taste of public equity markets, but it's very small. And in 2011 and 2012, bank credit committees started to get comfortable with solar because they had just come off of a wind push, right? So, and wind is more complicated, more moving parts, more things that can go wrong. But the credit committees were starting to warm up. In 2013, big yield cos went public, including NRG, and 2014. That's where they took the assets and put them in a separate vehicle, floated it publicly, and that is basically a yield mechanism that only owns renewables, wind and solar. And now there's a ton about to go public. First Solar and SunPower just announced they were going to go public. So you're talking about now massive public equity. And solar, where it was a niche that nobody understood, it was kind of a cute little side thing in 2009 and 10, it's now become its own asset class. And that's important because pension funds and global and domestic, as well as investors, they have these buckets. And they, are you an alternative? Are you oil and gas? Are you solar, right? So funds around the world are carving out a solar-specific pool of capital to invest. So again, you go from, so in 2014, and here's where I think the bond market, the debt market really arrived. 2014, there was a $2.5 billion, 579 megawatt project. Berkshire Hathaway did it. It was Mid-America, now Berkshire Hathaway Energy. They did it with 0 loan guarantees. So you go from 2011 requiring the DOE to 2014 with nothing. And if you just search the web, you'll see announcements of debt all the time. So all of a sudden, the debt markets have truly opened up. There's no subsidies for the debt. The equity markets are starting to open up and bubble, and there's a push to go public. And the securitizations are starting. So the bond market is starting to open up. And that's happened in 2013 and 14. So that is how capital flows. So the reality is installed capacity equals capital flow. You don't know where it's flowing from necessarily, but that's what it equals. So if you look here globally, here's the same sort of lens. Europe got a big head thanks to Germany. And there are 2 regulatory framework, which I think Ross might touch on, that opened up the door for capital. One is a feed-in tariff, and the other is net metering rules. And net metering rules basically requires the meter to run backwards if you have generation on site. So you, in essence, get to use the grid as your battery. And there's some controversy about that in terms of who pays for what, but at the end of the day, those 2 regulatory changes enabled capital flow. And Germany used the feed-in tariff, as did Europe. But you'll see here, that little red thing is China. And in 2014, that's China. So it goes from not even doing solar to this coming year doing 12, 15, 18 gigawatts of solar. That'll be 3 times what the US does. So let me bring it back to scale, and then I'll close. You haven't kicked me, but I'm sure I'm
Can you just, define for those of people in the audience, including me to some extent, what a feed-in tariff is,
so feed-in,
and a little more on what net metering means to a layman.
Right. So a feed-in tariff basically requires the utility and enables the utility to be able to buy power based on its generation source. So they're allowed to pay more for solar and less for coal. And so and they are allowed to recapture it in the rate base. So in essence, you can have, it basically means a kilowatt hour, not all kilowatt hours are created equal, and therefore you can price them differently. And so Germany had a program and said, we're going to require solar into the grid, and it's going to cost 40 cents or 40 pence or whatever a kilowatt. And so that basically enabled the solar to get financed. Because if they were competing back then with just all energy, it wouldn't have worked. The net metering is basically, it takes a one directional meter and makes it bidirectional. So if you have a solar panel on your house or on your business or in a farm, right? As it generates, and if you're not using it on site, your meter is running backwards. So in essence, you're literally putting kilowatt hours into the grid.
Into the grid.
And then at night, when the sun is down, it runs forward, but you have a backwards credit. So you can net out your usage over the course of a day, week, year, but it's not every minute that you're off the grid. So it's basically using the grid and that bidirectional meter to capture
Okay,
what
thanks.
you're
That
producing.
little explanation doesn't count on your 10 minutes.
Okay, good. So I want to bring it back to scale, though, because I've been thinking about scale a lot. Not only the sun versus usage, but what is 1 kilowatt hour? Like, what is that? Everybody talks about it, but nobody even knows what it is. So I want to tell you two things. What does it take to produce a kilowatt hour? Well, just under 9 ounces of oil. So you burn it, and it produces a kilowatt hour, and it's gone. It takes just over a pound of coal. You light it on fire, and it's gone. And it takes about 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. Again, you burn it, it's gone. It's great for pyros, because it's a lot of fun. It takes one panel, an average day of average sun, not Arizona where it's amazing, and not necessarily northern Canada where maybe it's not. One day will produce 1 kilowatt hour. One panel, one day, 1 kilowatt hour. But it can do it tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. And some days it'll do 2, and the other days it'll do none, right? Because it's variable, obviously. And then the question is, well, what can 1 kilowatt hour do? What does it actually do? Well, an 85 kilowatt hour Model S Tesla drives 265 miles on 85 kilowatt hours, right? So that means 1 kilowatt hour drives 5 kilometers or 3.11 miles. So that just gives you a sense of, and we're using, by the way, about 100 trillion kilowatt hours as human race, and we're producing 160 trillion kilowatt hours. We're just wasting a lot, but we're using 100 trillion kilowatt hours. So my view, and here's installed capacity if you're interested, but we can go back to that. My view is that the human race is going to think less about burning stuff for energy and more about harnessing sustainable resources for energy. And I just don't think that's stoppable. We just haven't had to do it, and our infrastructure isn't there to do it, and our technology isn't quite there to do it. But to, again, bring it back to scale, this is from the Washington Post, and it's somebody's thesis. This is the area that would be required to provide electricity to the entire world if you put solar panels there. It's about the state of West Virginia and located in the Sahara Desert, so there's not a lot of snow. Now there's massive technical and logistical problems with actually doing that, like how do you get the power from there over to here? But the reality is that's the scale of panels that we need to power the entire world for a year. So I just end on that. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David.
So, right, storage.
Yeah.
All right. Am I mic'd up? Oh.
You're on, Ross.
Hello, I'm Ross Channon, and as mentioned before, I'm now a visiting scholar with the Precourt Institute for Energy at Stanford. And that's the end of the presentation. Should we go back to the beginning? And what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is an understanding of the regulatory and grid environment that we have here in the US and also in Europe, right? The conditions that give rise to that, and how the conditions in developing markets are very different. And it goes to understanding how we want to get things right from a market orientation perspective as developing countries are going to be adding significant demand and capacity in the next 5 to 30 years. So for the past 100 years, obviously, energy is produced primarily, just by way of background, thermal and hydro plants, right? And so it makes all the sense in the world that grids and regulations should orient themselves to that reality, right? Until it no longer does, right? And we're coming to that place. And what I mean by that is that if you look, obviously, as Germany as an appropriate case study in the EU, right? And the next slide we'll talk about the US very briefly. You can see that in Germany now we have 10% of total generation in 2012 is from renewables, and about half of that is from generation that's variable, meaning you don't know when it's going to be coming on or coming off. As you will read extensively in press related to these issues, the debate is at the level of, there's a problem with variable generation, we're creating issues for the grid, who pays, right? And I would submit to you that market mechanisms in Europe, and now in the US we're beginning to do this, as we'll talk about, are only beginning to accommodate the ability for assets on the grid to accommodate flexibility and then actually value that ability. And it's a significant shortcoming that we have. We'll talk about why that is. The same thing here in the US. Times are changing. So very briefly, PJM is an interconnection on the grid that serves the mid-Atlantic United States, about 60 million people. It's the largest wholesale energy market on Earth. And you can see here the ramp from where we are today to expected solar and wind over the next 20 to 30 years. Okay, so things are going to be going up. Now, what are these new resources, right? And I think oftentimes also in conversations around, whether it's wind, solar, and what have you, just by, just at a very high level, new resources are both on the demand and supply side. And it's important, and on a going forward basis, that markets consider both together and not one or the other, right? So this is distributed and responsive, right? This is demand response and energy storage, right? Then you have centralized and variable generation. That's grid scale wind and solar. And then you have distributed and variable. It's rooftop and energy efficiency, right? So these are both on the demand and the supply side, is what we'll speak to. So Germany is an example of a leader in terms of integration of distributed solar. That being said, Germany only in this year and coming into next is only beginning to consider demand response as a resource that can be compensated, right? So those dislocations are significant, and they in fact don't make very much sense. We'll talk a little bit about why I think this is. So, to what environment are these new resources being introduced, right? Is it an environment where you have demand increasing, right, in Europe, as we see here, and then also in the US? No. In fact, demand for electricity is flattening, right, in both of these environments. And so what that means, whether you like it or not, is that when it comes to supplying actual capacity in a distributed fashion, in a centralized fashion, with a demand-side resource or with a supply-side resource, there will be winners and losers in this environment. That's a fact. And so what you get when you have winners and losers in a given environment, which is extremely large and influential, and particularly here in the US, is I couldn't actually find in a brief time as pointed a slide as I could in Europe as the US. But you see that the electricity has been a space that's gone from a relatively high growth space on an annualized basis back 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the actual makeup of the industry is fundamentally changing, where it's a yield business, if anything. So, and I don't have to say it, as David Crane, who's the CEO of NRG, mentioned less than a year or a little over a year ago, as demand flattens, we're going to stop making money, and that's not so good. Okay. And again, so what does flat demand give you in terms of an environment where you have definitive winners and losers for a given good, right? What you get is what I consider to be a balkanization of the actual regulatory structures that exist, as I'm sure David can speak to. there are certain places that things make sense here in the US and Europe that just don't, by virtue of who is able to win and lobby effectively in that process. And that's understandable, right? And so what you get for business process, for investment, right, is it's clearly, as David's mentioning, it's not bad, right? It could be a lot better. And also, I would submit we don't want to make the same mistake. They're not mistakes. We have a very different conditions in the developing world than we have here, right? And so, for instance, if we look at Europe, these are different renewable incentive schemes across Europe, right? So we have a feed-in tariff down in Germany. We have a quota system in other communities. And without getting into the details of this slide and the next two or three, the point is we have massively different regulatory regimes, market conditions, right, across a space that's not so massive, right, whereby there is also interconnection. So here, this slide addresses demand response in Europe, markets that you actually can have, you can actually be a demand response player, and those in which you simply cannot, right? And so, for instance, in Germany, in Spain, Italy, there's not yet a market mechanism or market design for demand response. And just by way of background, what is demand response? Demand response is the ability to be paid for curtailing or taking power off of the grid or demand off of the grid at particular times. So that's what demand response is. So basically, at some level, you may have too much demand on the grid. You have to curtail that demand. That's what a demand response player. So a leader in the market in the U.S. obviously is Enernoc. And Enernoc is now entering into Europe, right? But it's only happening, for instance, in Germany just now. Whereas at some high level, folks, one speaks about Germany as like this leading light in terms of bringing on distributed solar and bringing in resources, and I would say not on the demand side, right? And so that one but not the other does not make any sense in the abstract, but then when you unpack it, it does a lot in a zero-sum game, where there are certain wins you can have for a new resource, but you can't have all of those wins because someone stands to lose. Now here in the U.S., and I just kept with one slide on state-by-state solar policies. If you were to look on the right-hand side here, we have many different combinations of different policies. This graph should look confusing because it is. That's the intent, right? You have 43 different states with different mandates and otherwise, and there are different combinations of whether it's a net metering policy, whether it's the ability for third parties to own solar, and different combinations of those different states, and that affects an environment where someone can act and invest. So, balkanization from a market design and regulatory process is clearly, it's massively inefficient, right? It's kind of the takeaway, right? We have these overlapping, inconsistent regulatory regimes. We have different business environments across jurisdictional lines that obviously are going to increase your cost to operate and your cost to scale. And from an investment perspective, I'd love to hear David speak more to this, is that you have regulatory risk because markets can change in different environments, but also as an investor, you have to familiarize yourself with different regulatory regimes, right? That may be addressing the very same physical asset. And that's just going to increase your time cost to be able to look at those different opportunities. Not good. Just increase cost of business. So, what if it wasn't zero sum, right? And what this graph represents is, and the reason I gave this little bar up here, is from now through, I believe it's 2030 over there, we're going to see an increase in demand equivalent to just about the amount of demand we have currently in the developing world. That is, so again, we will see an increase in demand about equivalent to the amount of demand that we currently have in the developed world. That is very significant over the next 15, 20 years. So what that means is that is an environment in which there does not necessarily have to be firm winners and losers in a zero-sum game. And so then what that means is that the trenches that you have in an environment like energy in Europe and the US, where you have flat demand, the regulatory market components that could set up to protect interest in that way, not necessary, right, per se, in the developing world. And so we want to be careful, I would say, not to take the bad practices. We have a lot of good ones, but also a lot of necessary ones, right? Here in Europe and the U.S., and bring those, right, from an advisory perspective, into places like India, right, into markets like Turkey, into markets even like the Philippines, which is a free market. And so this is already happening, right, unfortunately. So in India, in the end of 2014, 9 Indian states announced net metering policies, right? Without first getting right, from my perspective, how did the distribution of power, which means the poles and wires that come to your house, right, or to your business, are actually owned and operated. And so what you've done is you've put in place a policy that sits at the end of the line, which for many reasons you had to do in Europe and the US to get around different blocks and interests in a zero-sum environment that you don't necessarily need to do, right, in a place like India. And we want to be careful that we're not effectively exporting policy mechanisms that make sense for this environment that don't make sense in a place where you're seeing a massive uptick in demand. Because not everyone has to lose. Everyone actually can win. And as David mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, absolutely a case that fossil fuels will play an essential role as places like India begin to develop or continue to develop. So, just at a high level to close up here is, what does this mean in terms of first principles, right? When we actually think about the integration of renewables on the supply side and demand response and energy efficiency on the demand side. These can be applied domestically, but really, really important to seek, I think, abroad, is unified markets for both demand and supply side resources. You want to have a single price, right, that resources compete against one another, right, and not pocketed markets for DR, in which DR players cannot compete against supply side resources. Now that's very it can be controversial here, domestically, because again you have people that will win and people that will lose. Right? That just creates inefficiency in a market where you want to bring electrification to, in India, 400 million people, right, are effectively unelectrified today. The second is grid neutrality, and what this means basically is that resources, whether the demand side or supply side, should have equal access to the grid, right? And what that means is it's important to decouple at some level the asset ownership, meaning who owns the poles and wires, from the entity that actually operates them. Because as you see in the US and Europe, clearly ownership of those poles and wires and the relationships that exist influence what can get on the grid and how quickly that can occur. And about 6 months ago, the former chairman of the FERC, John Wellinghoff, wrote a piece speaking to just this. He didn't call it grid neutrality, but effectively that's what he's speaking to. And the last is really, really important. And for those who want to get deeper into this subject, the national labs, so LBNL and NREL, do a wonderful job of diving really deep into market dynamics that we're going to be seeing. And for renewables specifically, it's really important that market designs on a going forward basis begin to compensate the flexibility of a resource itself, right? That is it. That if something needs to be flexible, right? You want to make sure you're compensating that in the market, and as obviously with wind and solar, these are forms of variable generation, right? This does not currently occur effectively in many markets. You can look to CAL-ISO, right? So what is CAL-ISO? It's the system operator of the grid, all the poles and wires out on the West Coast in California, right? And so that's what I'll close with. The point of the presentation at a very high level is simply, we have certain market realities here in Europe and the US that are fundamentally different from what you're going to be seeing over the next 20 years in the developing world. And we want to really take care that we appreciate that there's a reason that we have lines that we have here domestically and in Europe that actually don't really apply to developing environments. And we do not want to take the helpful but very imperfect market mechanisms that have been created and bring them. We want to take the lessons learned, right, that are very positive, but not the zero-sum game. So,
Thanks, Ross. Peter.
Thank you. There we go. Can I go to full screen? There it is. Okay, the built environment is responsible for about 40% of the carbon emissions that we are currently spewing into our atmosphere, and it's going up. If you can imagine this building without ventilation, we would not be in here very long. We'd be passing out, we'd be getting sick, we'd be getting dizzy. You have to turn the air over routinely. What you're looking at is how nature does that. This is a termite mound, about 18 feet tall in the Australian outback. Termites, well, let's put it this way, the queen termite is a very particular creature. She likes it just so in her environment inside these things. Whoops, wrong way to do that. Come back, come back. There we go. Whoop. So much for pushing the wrong button. What's happening? Okay. Now, this is a solar-powered air conditioning system. 2 meters down anywhere on the planet, the soil's temperature is 55 degrees. Termites burrow down into that cool soil, and then they build chimneys, which is basically what this is. And it's all convection, dragging hot air down into the cool soil, which is basically a heat sink, and then vented out the top. As I said, the queen's pretty particular. They keep the temperature and humidity inside these things virtually constant all year long. I mean, it's kind of amazing. So this is a biomimetic idea, right? This is how nature does it. So I'm going to show you 3 buildings and 1 industrial application that mimic this idea. Right? It only took 3.8 billion years for termites or nature to figure this kind of thing out. There are a myriad of these examples that we have yet to even understand, let alone discover. This is the field hospital at Las Gaviotas, which is a eco-village started 25 years ago in the eastern Vichada region of Colombia. They have reforested roughly 22,000 acres of fully canopied polyculture rainforest in a place that hasn't had rainforest in 650,000 years. That was a mouthful. But what I wanted to talk about is, this thing right here is the surgery. Now, if you're a surgeon, or more importantly, if you're the person being cut open, there are 2 things you don't want in your surgery. One is high temperature and one is high humidity, right? Because that promotes microbial growth, which is not something you want in your peritoneal cavity, right? Notice these things right here. Those are earthen funnels facing the prevailing wind. And there is a tunnel from each one going here to the surgery. And then on top, there are these chimneys that get heated up by the sun. So you have the prevailing air doing the pushing, you have the solar convection doing the pulling. And keep in mind, this is an equatorial site. This is routinely 100 to 110 degrees and humid as you can imagine, right? So you've got and they do this, they keep that surgery at about 30 degrees below the ambient outside temperature and the humidity well below the ambient humidity without a single moving part and not a drop of fossil fuel. No fuel of any kind. As long as the sun shines, this works, like the termite, right? You can I could maybe crawl through those tunnels. But that's one thing, you can cool the air. How do you get the humidity out of it over that roughly 100 yards? They stuck waste aluminum, scraps of aluminum, down into the cool soil in the bottoms of these tunnels and projected it up into where the air would pass over. That gave them a surface onto which to condense the vapor out of the water. Couldn't be easier. That's exactly what a refrigerator does or an air conditioner does. You run a condenser that it cools the surface, and then the moisture is withdrawn. Right? Again, no moving parts. There's so many stories. I could spend 2 hours on this one project alone someday. Okay, this is a different part of the world. This is in Lagerberg, Sweden. This is a school for kindergarten through 5th grade. 150 students. This is about 100 kilometers south of the Arctic Circle in northern Sweden. This is the old part of the school, and this is the new part. This was designed by a man named Anders Nyqvist, who's been a green architect in Sweden for 45 years, since before there was such a thing. Spent his entire career thinking and operating in this way. This school turns over the entire internal air volume of that building every half hour with fresh air, with no fans or mechanism of any kind. Right? It's exactly the same system. This is the intakes. There's one on the front of the building, one on the back. This school has the highest performance in science and mathematics of any school of its group in Sweden, where they take these things very seriously. Families move from all over Sweden to move to this district so their children can attend this school. That's a schematic. Alas, it's in Swedish. But you basically see the intake and then the flow up through the middle. It flows by a bunch of tropical plants, which actually the students all take care of, and that actually cleans the air as well. And then out the top. And the complaint is in the summer it's too cold. People who work there during the summer are like, how do you do that? Well, what do? You open the window in your room, pulling in different temperature air. Very low tech, but kind of makes some sense, doesn't it? That's Anders. Adorable fellow, exactly the way he looks. So those are two buildings that are on a small-ish scale. This building was designed or conceived of by Bengt Varna, and also a Swedish architect who passed away maybe 10 years ago. It was engineered by Arup in London, a major engineering firm in the world. This building covers 2 city blocks in downtown Harare, Zimbabwe. It's a mixed-use building. It's 10 stories. It's shops, it's offices, it's residents. It's quite an amazing thing. That's the internal atrium. This building was actually brought to being because when Robert Mugabe took over in a coup, Zimbabwe there was a moratorium against sending oil to Zimbabwe. And so they had to figure out other ways to generate energy and cool buildings and whatnot. So they got Arup involved and Bengt Varna. That's exactly the same system, the termite ventilation system, exactly what it is. Same thing, a little more involved. Okay, those are the 3 buildings. This is one of the most elegant solutions to an actual engineering problem that I've seen. This is the work of a man named Jay Harman and his company PAC Scientific in San Rafael, California. Jay is an Australian physicist, grew up swimming and surfing, as most Aussies do, and he had an interesting epiphany while swimming. In the surf. He was tossed around, and he reached out to grab some kelp to keep himself stable, and of course it just tore off in his hand. But he wondered why tons of water crashing over this kelp, actually the kelp wasn't bothered. The water was just passed by. And it all had to do with the shape, the form that the kelp took to present the least resistance to passing water. So this thing is called the Lily Impeller. It's about this big. And Jay was commissioned, let's put it this way, the University of California at Davis had a 1 million gallon drinking water reservoir tank that they were having problems with. And the problem was the water would come out of the ground cold and go in and settle on the bottom of the tank. And then it would striate temperature-wise, and the upper layers would be warm enough to support algae growth, right? And the normal way we deal with this, if you have a swimming pool, is you toss a bucket of chemicals in, and that takes care of it. Alas, you can't do that with drinking water, at least not at the University of California at Davis. So they hired an engineering firm to conventionally engineer a solution for this. And their solution was going to cost millions of dollars. And it was basically a bunch of tubes that would have been put into the bottom of the tank, and compressors running constantly to bubble this, have a bubbler, basically. That's a very conventional approach to this kind of thing. So Jay was commissioned to say, you got to have a better way to do this. This is going to cost us a fortune. The carrying cost and maintenance cost and all the rest of it was going to be problematic. So when I visited his studio, he had a tank about maybe this big, 6 or 8 feet deep. And in that tank was a little, what looked like a wooden life ring, and with a 24-watt motor suspended there, and this thing attached to that into the water. And he said, now watch this. And he turns the thing on a little rheostat, and there's sort of confusion, and a perfect vortex formed, top to bottom. And he had these neutrally buoyant day-glow green balls floating around there. And you could see the whole thing doing this. This is in like 2 seconds. Beautiful. And if you've ever seen a vortex, or you've seen an X-ray of a conch shell, or any of these things, again, it's a biomimetic formula, if you will. And so he mounted this thing with a 24-watt electric motor on this life ring with a 32-watt solar collector, and floated it out on top of this 1 million gallons of drinking water. And he didn't know if it was going to work. And what he really wanted to know is how long it would take. He figured it would work, but how long would it take? 20 hours. The temperature in that was homogeneous, right? All below the temperature that would support algae growth. As long as the sun shines, you got it. Jay, this you'll recognize as the nautilus shell. And this, the lily impeller, if you're familiar with the calla lily, it's basically similar. And they've developed some really interesting parametric design tools on the computer to develop these. They've developed the world's most efficient computer cooling fan. They've developed, they're working with Coca-Cola for all their cooling stuff in all their vending machines. They're working with the Delphi, the auto supply company. And it's, I don't know, I just love it. I don't know what I can tell you. It's just, that's Jay there, and the calla lily and the impeller. And this is how they deploy it now. It's actually, instead of floating on top, it's anchored to the bottom of the tank. And it seems to be a little more efficient that way. And again, it's only going like maybe 40 RPMs. Mm-hmm. You know, couldn't be easier. And that vortex goes, doesn't seem to matter how deep the tank is or how much water, it just gets it going. Astonishing. Anyway. I end my lectures with this one. Probably the most influential photograph ever taken. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. Well, we have still a decent period of time, and maybe I can start by raising a few questions based on what all of you have said. And let me ask David first, and no, have the audience ask some questions. You know, you're in the business of making money ultimately as a venture capitalist. At some point, when you make an investment, you expect the companies to, give you a return. You're optimistic, given the graphs that you showed us about costs coming down, and that there's been certainly an increased usage of solar. But listening to what Ross said, for example, and other things, what are the obstacles that you're facing? Can you really expect companies you're investing in to break even in a reasonable period of time? What's it going to take? And what are the risks given, what Ross was talking about, which in its most, it seems to me, put in its most simple way, is, yeah, there are going to be some losers, and frankly, the losers in this case, at least in the short to medium term, unless they adjust somehow, are going to be the public utilities who, as there's increased renewables, they're going to be unless they in fact receive monies back, which they do in some states, I guess, they're going to be a constant force to try to stop this and to make it more difficult to expand. I don't say that in a pejorative way. I just say, hey, they're in the business of ultimately making money too, and they have all sorts of assets, and they want to sell electricity. Yeah. So what makes you such an optimistic person, and how do you?
Because the opposite isn't fun.
Right. But how do you justify that, these investments are going to provide you a return over a reasonable period of time?
Well, so there's a continuum of investments. There is the more venture side, as you were mentioning, which is taking company risk, technology risk, and hoping to either invent, deploy, enter a market with something new. And then there's the more infrastructure investment, which is, it's already been proven, right? It's a hard asset. It's got a long life, 20, 30, 40 years. And in that infrastructure bucket are airports and roads and bridges and, pipelines for oil and gas. So big, clunky, heavy, high capital up front, and then sort of low capital as you operate it. Nuclear, huge capital up front. There's a lot of obstacles for sure. And in fact, I'm reminded of a headline last year which just said Barclays downgrades entire electric utility sector due to solar competition. Goldman Sachs has come out with this. And again, when you look at that chart, in 2010, nobody gave a care about solar, right? And here, that was for 2014, that title. Now they're downgrading an entire sector. So, I think the smart utilities, it's like you got a couple choices. You try to beat them, or you join them. The other thing that's amazing, back to capital flow and how is this stuff getting built, massive investments from the utilities themselves are going into solar now. So they're hedging, right? And they probably see a tide coming. And then there's several sort of components of their business model which will not be impacted. So take National Grid in New England. They don't own any generation at all anymore. They sold off all of their plants. So they basically own and keep up the meters, the wires, the poles. The storm comes through, it's their trucks having to rebuild. They bill, so there's administration, transmission, distribution. They actually are pretty agnostic to solar, and they're going to make their money no matter what. And interestingly, a lot of utilities make no money on the energy itself. It's a direct pass-through cost. So if you open up your bill, let's say you pay 15 cents a kilowatt hour. And some people pay 30 something, and some people pay 7. But in the sort of New England area, it's actually about 20 now because of last year's polar vortex and this, that, and the other. But about 5 cents of that is the actual energy. 5 out of the 15, 5 out of the 20. The rest are these other costs to keep the grid up. So people always talk about the energy component. My thing is, look, natural gas could be free, and you can still be competitive at the retail with solar, right? That's where this is going, and that's really interesting. So I think business models are going to change. I think they are going to fight it, and they do. And I think there's an unfairness going on, which is what I was talking about, net metering. In Arizona, APS is famous for fighting it, and they're right? So you take a house that puts solar on its roof, or a business, and they're allowed to use the grid when they need it, always there for you, and then allowed to take it back, and they're not paying anything for that meter running forwards and backwards, which means basically that cost of losing that customer is going to all the other customers who do not have solar, right? There needs to be a balance because we need a healthy grid. And so, there's regulatory issues. And when people talk about the solar market, not only in the U.S. but globally, but let's just take the U.S. I always say there is not a solar market. There is 1,000 tiny solar markets, across the street. We looked at a deal, literally, a street in Phoenix. The building on the right-hand side of the street was a great investment. The building on the left-hand side of the street, you couldn't ever do. That was the line of the regulatory change. One road, same sun, same everything else.
Right, and the grid as we know it is not actually oriented this way.
Right.
And so, look, you have, for instance, so PJM. What is PJM again? It's the wholesale market we have that serves power to the Mid-Atlantic, right? And is in many respects, very forward-looking in terms of integrating new resources, right? Shortening the time frames with respect to those resources when they can get online. It is also the case that PJM is influential in helping to decide how new transmission lines are being built. It is the case that players in the market are paying for transmission lines to be built to meet renewable portfolio standards on a state-by-state basis. That it's not may or may not make sense for where actually demand exists. I would say does not make sense in a number of cases where demand exists, right? And so to David's point, you have regulatory structures that exist for the reasons I think we outlined. It makes sense that are still affecting the environment today, but also the environment is also, to his point, pushing itself forward, right? So, and we're pushing forward more in spite of these things sometimes than because of them. Yeah. It's okay, right? But it is what it is.
And I think I think the scariest thing for traditional utilities is the battery solar combo.
Yeah.
And once the intermittence is solved.
Once that's solved, you just cut the wire. Like, think of landlines, for example, when it went wireless. Like, you just people don't even have landlines anymore, And so if you had solar and a battery that kept your house up, and by the way, it might be more stable than the grid, because Hurricane Sandy comes through, and you know what? As long as your panels don't blow off your roof, and as long as you've stored enough energy in your basement, in your batteries, it can be better than the grid. That, to me, puts a lot of people just out of business.
How many years are we away from that?
I think at scale, we're pretty far. But at sort of pockets, I think it's starting already.
It'll be interesting to see how quickly Tesla can move in its efficiency improvements on lithium ion.
Yeah.
Right? TBD.
When I was out in California a month or two, speaking of Tesla, a month or two ago, and that's where I met Ross. One of my colleagues here and I went to visit Tesla. And they let me, which was a big mistake, although I didn't crash it, test drive one of their new models. And it literally goes from 0 to 60 in 3.2 seconds. I mean, the biggest danger they're going to have are suits for whiplash. But it's unbelievable. But the cost, it'll be priced at $72,000, and it'll have a range of 250 miles, and they're putting in charging stations and all that stuff. And it just seems to me that once they get at some point, it'll be like the Model T Ford, and they'll get the cost down to what a reasonable price for a car, say $35,000. Maybe they'll get a battery, they'll make improvements in the battery and get it up to 350 miles, and then why wouldn't anybody buy it by definition?
Yeah, it's better.
I mean, it's just going to happen, it seems to me.
And I looked at a graph of costs because, again, how do industries start, right? How does anything start? If you look at the compute order that cost for 1 megabyte of storage back in the 70s, it was $100,000 plus for 1 megabyte. And so it's Moore's law for computing and how many circuits they can fit on a thing, and it's plummeting in both cost and capability. There's a Swanson effect with solar, which is sort of that. And we're in the we're not in the 70s equivalent, but we're probably in the 80s of that. So I think the costs of batteries and the efficiency of batteries and the cost of solar and the efficiency of solar is going to follow not as fast of a trend of doubling every 18 months, which was Moore's famous calculation, but it's on that trajectory. And there's no historic reason on any industry why I think will not continue.
Let me ask, there's a question in the back, I see, wow, 5 hands. Let me just ask Peter a quick question, and then we'll have maybe 15 minutes for questions. Peter, listening to what you're talking about, it would sound like that one of the solutions to all of these issues is by doing the kinds of things that you're talking about, you actually reduce the need for electricity. And how big a factor is that going to be, do you think?
Well, I think I was very interested to see Ross's slide of the decline in demand for electricity, the flattening, and what David Crane referred to as not good, this is unhappy, right? But when you think of transitioning our transportation to electricity, I mean, to me, that turns the scale in a whole nother way. You've got a huge amount of demand there, right? And I think, we tend to focus a little too narrowly on areas. We really need to look at the entire energy picture, everything. Because, like, for instance, I think storage could be connected to the car batteries. I mean, that could be again, this is all in its infancy, but ultimately it will be, as David correctly states, that's the direction we're headed, and there's nothing to stop it.
Yeah, and if I could just very briefly piggyback on what Peter was saying, so in terms of just the sheer reduction, right, of energy. So the form of that demand response reacts to actual events in the market. Hey, big industrial plant, turn off your power. We need to cut demand. There's also energy efficiency itself, right, where by virtue of the technologies that are installed, you just end up using less power. An example of that in terms of getting more of that into market is that unlike demand response or solar or wind, the actual market mechanisms for energy efficiency when you install a LED versus an incandescent bulb, there's not clear access to the full value of that resource in open markets, right? So in terms of it's the technology, and it's also the market mechanism, right, that treats both demand side and supply side resources equivalently, and then also values the components of those technologies that help help achieve.
Which is what your company was all about, right?
I think that one of the struggles or one of the hurdles is that there's a lot of regulatory push that I think would be detrimental to the advancement of technology. Right. I think it's ridiculous because I think technology is just going to motor by it.
Okay, let's. I'm going to go to the first hand that I saw originally, back in the corner there, and then we'll sort of come around the room.
Thanks. Terry Hill of the Passive House Institute.
Hello.
I was very hopeful as the panel went on that we were going to connect all the dots. But I still, and I'm very excited that there was really no utility focus here. But what about the inherent megawatts in the existing infrastructure, in the buildings? How are we going to tap that? And whether or not the utility could transition to its new role in financing the retrofitting of existing buildings. There's a tremendous amount of energy sitting in that. So I'd like the group's comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah.
Whoever.
I can speak to that very specifically. So if we're talking about megawatts, I mean just efficiency itself, right? Okay. So the way it works in really everywhere in the U.S. Is the regulated utility, whether or not that utility is vertically integrated, meaning it owns generation, transmission, distribution, and the customer relationship, or the utility is just the transmission and distribution entity, like we have National Grid now, for instance. That utility is incentivized to meet certain goals for efficiency, right? And it is through the meeting of those goals that things tend to be financed, right? There are also ways of financing for very large scale, just the actual savings themselves end up making sense in terms of the cost of capital. That being said, right, what we don't have here in the United States is the ability to go get energy efficiency megawatts actually fully compensated in energy markets. That is not yet possible. You can be compensated in the forward markets for energy. So to make sure we have regulatorily created here in the Mid-Atlantic in PJM, and up in New England, and also a little bit in the Midwest, a market that pays a certain amount of money out, right, to make sure there's enough capacity or power on the grid in future years. It takes time to build this stuff. You can get paid for efficiency in that context. However, that value for the efficiency is about 20% of what you could earn in the actual real-time markets. Right, so efficiency is compensated in these forward markets, not in the real-time stuff. And I would submit only because you have a stakeholder process in which that's not the largest, the most powerful voice. And so to answer your question, if you wanted to do so at the most efficient level of scale, you'd want to open up efficiency to allow it to earn the full energy value, because it is an extremely cost-competitive resource today, right now. So yeah.
And I think capital is heading there. It wants to go there. It just hasn't figured it out. Like there's ESCO, these shared savings, as you probably know. But one of the most creative things I think is putting it into the tax base. Because the problem with this stuff is it's a massive upfront investment, and the payoff is over a long time, right? So who makes the massive upfront investment? And what if you have a house and you're renting and your landlord doesn't pay the bill? There's the total disincentive, right? What if you own the house, but your savings, it takes you 7 years to return the capital, which would be great. It's a 15% annualized return. Right now, if you have cash, it's not even 1%, right? But what if you don't have the money up front? Or what if you think you might move? So putting it in the tax base of the house, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac blocked that, right? Because they saw that as a lien against their value. So again, you get into like the fights and the winners and losers and the whatever. But if you spent 20 grand to turn your house more efficient, and in return you paid $500 a year more in taxes as a separate line item to the town, and that went to when you sold the house, and you had less bills while you lived there, like it's a no-brainer mathematically on a spreadsheet. It's just you got to figure out how to do it. And companies, the capital's too clunky right now to really go knock on every house and spray foam and change windows, and the passive house thing I think is incredible. There's a company, Nest, here that's got the idea you can heat your house and candles, your body heat, and a few light bulbs 24/7 is brilliant. So.
Yes, right.
Yes, hi, Andrew Patterson with Environmental Business International. One of the challenges that we've heard at a DOE conference last month is with solar, more than 70% of solar panels now are made outside the U.S. China dumped solar panels. It killed a lot of venture-backed solar makers in the U.S. Wind is worse. 90% of the wind turbines installed globally are made outside the U.S. GE seems to be the only one registering. So the more renewables we mandate, it seems the more they're made outside the U.S. Maybe we don't care because we're winning the cost argument, but then the green jobs argument totally gets blown out of the water.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. Apple is a Chinese company. Apple is a Chinese company. Every Apple product, and they have a cute little Mac thing that they just brought back, is made in China. They're a design company. So you're right, and I'm not sure how much it matters. The reality is 65 cents is going to China. Some of that's shipping costs, and some of it's tariffs, by the way. We have a 20-some-odd% tariff, which goes to the government, Department of Commerce.
iPhones or solar panels?
Solar panels, yeah, sorry, yeah. So we're trying to fight that fight. And the lawsuit was brought by a German company. There actually weren't that many U.S. panel companies, but Germany really got...
That's a dumping suit,
The dumping lawsuit was brought by SolarWorld. It was really Germany. But, my view is... Now, I'm not a World Trade Organization expert, but my view is it should be fair, without a doubt, and I don't know what the definition of fair is, but I've been to China several times to visit the factories. What's interesting is that equipment that makes the panels are not Chinese. They're American. They're Applied Materials. It's all robotic. So it's like they're buying equipment here to make it there. Labor costs are going down per panel because it's all automated. And so it's like, I don't know the right answer, but I know it's not inherently a bad thing. And you look at it, look at a lot of products. And by the way, it's moving out of China. What's interesting about this whole fracking thing and energy is China's labor has been going up annually 20 to 30% for a while. Well, it started at a low base. So, but the U.S. has this extra natural gas that we've just discovered, and so the cost of manufacturing here is going down, and Dow Chemical is like thrilled about that because they're use a ton of energy, right? So a lot of people are in fact looking right now at bringing manufacturing back, not because it's fair or not fair, but because they want it. You save all that shipping, you save time, and the reality is it's glass. And now they might do glass on glass, which is a lot of Corning stuff, right? And DuPont makes the backing sheet that's put in China, right? So it's glass, it's silicon, and it's some wires, right? Some thin wires. That, I think everybody's gonna be fine. And I don't think if it all stays, I don't think it's gonna stay in China, because I think it's gonna equalize and come back here. And in the meantime, if there's something unfair, like we're already penalizing it, and I don't have enough information to judge the tariff percentage and who's doing what to who. But I'm not concerned about it. I think it'll work itself out.
Yeah, in terms of solar manufacture, if you speak, I think, to folks in the venture community broadly, this is painting a broad brush here, is that the hardware itself is seen as effectively a commodity now. Mm-hmm. And solar businesses are financing businesses, right? Insofar as what matters is the market or regulatory environment, right? Your cost of acquiring a customer, right? And then the inputs, again, are assumed to be a commodity at this point. And so what matters is, I think, more cost of acquisition, right? The actual customer itself, and the market or regulatory environment. Where the jobs come in, I think, is on the installation side, on the maintenance side, and what have you, right? To be clear, in terms of manufacturer, we'll see, right? And David's much closer to that than I am.
Yeah, so I have two hands here. Why don't we start here, and to you, and then we'll have two questions there, and then I think we'll be pretty much at the end of our time.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Lawrence Jones. I'm with Alstom Grid. I'm also with an organization called the Center for Sustainable Development in Africa. I've been working in the renewable industry for at least 20 years, looking at renewable integrations around the world. I have a question, but before that, a quick comment. So one of the things we haven't talked about this morning is the fact that about 100 years ago, something evolved called the Regulatory Compact. That compact was created because the country didn't have enough money. We needed to have investments brought in to build infrastructure, and that was how the grid evolved because of that compact. The compact has been in place now for 100 years. It has worked. What we're discussing now is, do we need to revisit the compact, and if we do, how we do it. I like your point about not having winners and losers, because I think it's very important. Part of the compact we shouldn't talk about is the fact that utilities, and we shouldn't be generalizing the word utilities, but for the most part have made money based on volumetric sales, right? To sell electricity. Right. The change that we're advocating would mean that utilities will have to move away from just selling volume, but offering service. And that will mean that the compact will have to change. So I'd like to get your points or your perspectives on if we ought to change the compact, because we're now facing a need for $2 trillion of infrastructure investment in the U.S. Rocky Mountain Institute have said that the defection from the grid that most people think is going to happen will not happen, not at the scale that we think. So we'll still need the grid. But if everyone gets off the grid, who's going to pay for the grid? Exactly. And how do we balance it out?
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Let's take a second question and then let the panel respond.
Right. Thanks. I'm Anmol Vanmali. I'm a director at the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation, also senior fellow at the World Watch Institute. And I have a related question, actually. So, and this is to the point that Ross made, that we can't really impose some of what has worked in the developed world and developing world. And one of the most important things we need to get ahead of the curve in the developing world is decoupling, which is something you touched upon. And decoupling is hairy and messy, and we've never really seen it work perfectly. One of the other ways of doing it is to establish another type of utility called the sustainable energy utility, that instead of selling watts, sells negawatts, and sells energy at the edge, which is distributed generation. And that way you unleash two market forces. You have the typical utility that does what it does best, which is procure the cheapest form of electricity and transmit it at the cheapest form of electricity. And you have the sustainable energy utility who does what it does best, which is find the best efficiency opportunities and finance it the best way it can. So do you think this could be something that could work in the developing world and probably even in the US, as we have demonstrated in Vermont, in DC, and in Ohio?
And then what happens to the assets that are, at that point, which was your question. Okay, why don't you respond to those two questions?
Yeah, so if I take them in tandem, with respect to the regulatory compact, right? So we can look at we have some Supreme Court jurisprudence on this, right? But beyond that, the grid exists and has been created to have reliable, right, and cost-effective power for citizens because it's considered to be a public good, right? So the question that so I am also, it is the case that the grid's going to be around for a long time and really essential. Those who speak about a utility death spiral or like this is incendiary stuff that it's for me not terribly helpful, right? That being said, right. What is the orientation? Does the compact change, right? I don't know that the compact changes, right? Except for now, we have a public policy consideration, which is let's reliably and cost effectively provide electrification to society that maybe also doesn't create so much massive carbon, right? And that's kind of the addition, right, if you will, right? And so therefore, right. What are the most reliable but also efficient and effective ways of providing that compact, right? And so maybe it's in this kind of to transition to answer the second question in terms of procurement of power or procurement of megawatts. Like for me, I think what we're observing in PJM and ISO New England is that can be done very effectively, right, with a market mechanism, right? And I would be. I don't know that it's the most efficient, right, to have just a given utility procure power on behalf of consumers, and certainly it is not from a negawatt perspective. That's definitely not the case. That's a longer conversation. So I think to make it a short answer is you want to ask what are the most efficient mechanisms to do so, and I think market performance here in the U.S. in PJM serves 60 million people. Is doing so, extremely effectively, integrating new resources effectively. That's where you want to see in the developing world if it were me, right? So I hope that answers the questions, right?
Okay. Do you want to add anything to that, David?
No, I think.
Okay. I see three hands, and then let's take them all at one time, and that'll be it.
I'm Lenny Berliner. I'm president of Energy Farms International, and I have a concern about the rate of uptake of innovation and new technology. I used to be a solar developer once upon a time, and I can tell you one of the things that has led to the increase is not so much the drop in cost of polycrystalline, but the increase in efficiencies. And we had to wait for an increase in efficiency because that was a technological fix. I mentor a number of clean tech companies, and one of the things that I see as a tremendous barrier is the relative scarcity of testing facilities and money for testing at an appropriate scale. And I just wondered what Mr. Milner thought might be happening in the venture capital markets, if he can speak to the venture capital markets, as to their willingness to take that kind of a risk and move things along.
Okay, thank you. Question over here and then in the front.
Yes, Bob Wright, Department of Energy. This question's also for David. You indicated that with the three areas of capital, bonds, debt, and public, do you think the current interest rate environment for the last, 5, 6 years, however long that has been, will change that if rates ever return to what I would call a historical average?
Okay, good question. And then the third question.
Michael Copley, SNL Energy. A third for David.
I'm in trouble.
That's right.
The investment tax credit scheduled to drop from 30% to 10% of next year. Do tax equity investors stick around for that 10% slice? And then to the extent that there's less tax equity in a deal, what does the capital stack look like? And what are the consequences for the cost of capital? Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, on the venture side, and I'm much more on the infrastructure side, I think the more there is pressure in two areas. One is subsidies going down and interest rates going up, the more they're going to be, and the more that's actually deployed, right? The more the efficiency and the testing and to make sure this stuff really does last and work, which is one of the China concerns. Like, okay, it says there's a warranty for 25 years, but is it really going to last? Because then you have to re-panel stuff if it really fails. Now, so far, and that was one of the early capital concerns. It's interesting, there were these tier one and who's allowed to be loaned against and who's not. Everybody has sort of come, and I don't know if it's true, right? I'll be honest with you, I don't know in 10 years whether these panels are gonna really, or the thin film. I mean, we don't know, we're in a new industry, right? So, and anybody who pretends to know, I think, isn't quite being completely honest with themselves. Because in any new industry, there's gonna be some bad stuff. And I think that the interest in making it better and understanding what even better is going up and not down. And that's not something we do, but it's talked about a lot. And that's true with asset management, by the way. There's an asset management conference because you own these things and everybody's realizing, oh my gosh, like how do you, they don't really, it's not plug and play, no moving parts, you do nothing. It's not that at all. There's a lot of stuff that goes wrong in inverters, snow removal. I mean, entire systems collapsed up in New England, almost like a roof collapsed because the racking wasn't strong enough. And so you have warranty claims. And what's interesting, and we had this in 9 panels, everybody thought the panel was going to be the weak part and the glass would snap. Well, we had 9 panels that broke because the racking, the metal underneath broke and gave way. Now 9 out of, 100,000, right? So it's not a big deal, but it's just, people don't even know where the problems might come up, right? So we're learning.
Well, if you want increased improvements, not just in storage, but in reliability for expanding for transmission from, say, offshore wind and whatnot. But a number of my protege companies are involved in the vertical axis wind turbine space, which is an area that a lot of designers.
Yeah, those are very cool.
There's all kinds of vertical axis wind turbines. And you can't test them.
Yeah. Well, it's a classic valley of death. I mean, there's a whole, you have a concept, but nobody wants to actually test it because it's too much money. And if it doesn't work, everybody's just, so there's it's a catch-22. But I think as there's more pressure on it from interest rates and subsidies and more interest, I do think it's going to happen. And there will be R&D centers that are, look at what the drug companies built up in terms of their R&D and testing and over the last 100 years. We are the first batter of the first inning, and we're learning, and that graph is amazing, but it's also a rounding error in our usage as a country and as a world. So on interest rates, it's interesting. Obviously, sustained low interest rates create, in essence, asset bubbles, right? And one can look across everything, and we have this fear. So when we're in construction, we don't know what we're necessarily going to fix and swap that rate at. So what if you underwrite it at X, and then there's some world thing, and T-bills go up by 2%, which they arguably that wouldn't even be a big deal historically. It'd be still low, but not necessarily when everything's priced to perfection. So I think. And this sort of answers both of those questions at once. I think as the ITC drops and or as interest rates rise, there will be more efficiencies pulled out. The cost will find 20% in the cost. And by the way, retail rates, even though demand's going down, retail rates are not going down. They're going up. And there's a lot, and climate change, or however you want to think about that, our weird weather patterns are actually increasing retail rates. And so if you're offsetting retail rates, you can have a view that they're going to go up at or better than inflation. So if you can have your costs go at or down every year and efficiency up, it can make up for some of the losses of more expensive debt and or less ITC.
Okay, I think that takes us to the end. I want to thank all the panelists. I think this was a terrific panel, and thank you to the people, to the audience. Obviously a very interested audience with a lot of knowledge. You had very good questions, and the kinds of things we're talking about today, we have to reach out to even more people, because I think these are going to be critical issues over the coming years. And I see this as, from the Atlantic Council standpoint, just a beginning. But so, thank you very much.
Thank
you
you.
all for coming.